Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and this is AutoAlchemy, the intersection between typology and self-growth. And this video is a response to Erik Thor's recent video on the objective personality approach to the functions. Let's get into it. Alright, welcome back to my channel. If you want to support my work and get early access to content like this, don't forget to check out my Buy Me a Coffee page. Anyway, I really want to take Erik's critique of OPS seriously, mainly because his critiques are not merely his own. They're bound to be reflected by other community members, especially if he's out there broadcasting his interpretations to other people. Another reason to take Erik seriously is the kernel of truth to what he's saying. I've said myself that there are some real voids in the objective personality system, particularly when it comes to communicating the information clearly and also contextualizing the work in relationship to the work of Carl Jung. And because I've spent much of the last few years on an odyssey into the origins of typology, this seemed like a great occasion to fill in some of those voids while addressing Erik's critiques. By the way, this video is probably going to be pretty dense, but I'll try to condense everything into a summary at the end. Regardless, I hope you will remain with me for the duration of the journey. Anyway, let's start with an overview of Erik's critique. So first, Erik claims that the OPS function definitions are simple one-liners, basically the typology equivalent of going to McDonald's and ordering a cheeseburger, which is itself a nicely reductive one-liner. One example that Erik gives here is that in OPS, introverted intuition is simply organizing plus ideas. So according to Erik, in OPS, if you're organizing ideas, then you are automatically using introverted intuition.
That's how easy it is. That's how simple it is.
And for Erik, this is like a child approaching a group of scientists and saying, hey, check this out. The sun can be defined as hot plus air, and the moon can be defined as cold plus air. So for Erik, something is lost in translation here. Erik's second point is that the OPS functions are not the same cognitive functions that everybody else in typology is referring to. And therefore, point 3, OPS should revisit the source material because there is little to no relationship with Jung's original ideas. Now, I think that's a pretty fair summary of Erik's points. I think he would agree. So I want to move on to unpacking those points. Let's start off by looking at the claim that the OPS functions are mere one-liners. This is kind of tricky to address because, as the OPS website itself indicates, their definitions are not complete, they're not final, this is a work in progress. And in my personal opinion, their current definitions are best viewed as tools for triangulating a person's type. These so-called one-liners condense complex phenomena into something that you can actually work with, in the same way that most psychological study proceeds with operational definitions that improve over time. For example, intelligence as a construct could be operationally defined as scores on the SAT, scores on the GRE. That sort of definition isn't going to capture the nuanced totality of what intelligence is, but it could give you a pretty decent starting point when you're looking for correlations and trying to figure something out. When I'm attempting to type someone, thinking of NE as intuition plus the human need of gathering helps ground me in the same way that BB's semantic fields might ground some other typologist. It's a heuristic that really helps me type, especially if I keep in mind the full context of the objective personality system, which brings me to my main problem with this one-liner argument. Erik's critique of these definitions ignores so much context. He ignores the notion of binary coins, tidal waves, savior state versus demon state, and all of those concepts have a real basis in Jung's work. In OPS, it's not merely the case that if you organize ideas, you're using introverted intuition. A better way of saying it is, if you compulsively disrespect details and tangible reality in favor of chasing down abstract understandings and patterns, and you compulsively stick to the familiar and known patterns at the expense of open-ended exploration of novelty, then you're using introverted intuition in a savior state. But that's not enough. You then have to cross-check that you have a lot of animalistic, visceral fear built up around dealing with the sensory, dealing with novelty, because you're never looking at those things. And because you're automatically repressing, excluding those things from consciousness, when you do deal with them, they're going to be contaminated by and draw up all of this extra negativity from the unconscious. Hence the idea of a demon state. Jung himself literally compared blowouts of unconscious buildup with demonic possession. More on demon states in a little bit. Another crucial piece of context that Erik overlooks is that each function actually operates within an ecology of other functions, needs, animals, and modalities. Your objective personality type is this interdependent whole, and so it's hard to imagine how you could robustly define a single variable without losing something. It's like dissecting a frog. You can take it apart, but something is lost. It's no longer a living organic whole. In any case, that's why I don't think the OPS functions are just that simple. And for anybody who still thinks so, I challenge you to try to use those seemingly simplistic understandings to type someone for the OPS class. All right, so now to address Erik's criticism that OPS redefines the cognitive functions and that Dave and Shan would benefit from revisiting Carl Jung. This criticism seems to me to be a little more valuable. As I said, this video is actually intended to address some of the voids that I see in the objective personality system. At the same time, I want to explain why I think Dave and Shan's work is closest in spirit to Jung's original ideas, despite some cosmetic differences. Erik is also right-ish that the OPS functions sometimes seem to point at something other than what many type enthusiasts are discussing. And I don't see that as a real problem for a couple of reasons. First of all, most typology talk amounts to an endless circle jerk where nothing significant ever seems to get built. To me, that says that there might actually be a problem with the way that people are typically talking about the functions. Additionally, virtually all internet typologists are overlooking key features of the functions as defined by Jung. I see both of those problems as clearly related to each other. We've collectively inherited many misconceptions, including some from Myers and Briggs, about whom Jung essentially said, "With friends like these, who needs enemies?" In any case, I think it's safe to say that we would all benefit from a visit with Grandpa Jung. So, let's see what the source himself has to say about cognitive functions. That's weird. The reality is that in all of psychological types, Jung himself never once mentions the words cognitive functions. For Jung, thinking, feeling, sensation, and intuition are all psychological functions, functions of the psyche. And you might think that that is pedantic, semantic, nitpicking, and you're right. But the point is, the Jungian psyche is not about disembodied cognition. It acknowledges that mind and body are an integrated unity shared by our long legacy as evolutionary creatures. Hence Jung's emphasis on the 2-million-year-old man within us. Anyway, it's this emphasis on evolution and embodied cognition that provides the theoretical bridge between Jung's ideas and the OPS model. In the type community, we generally accept that the functions are the building blocks of the psyche. But in a psychological theory of types, Jung calls complexes the building blocks of the psyche. And that apparent paradox quickly dissolves when you realize that for Jung, the preferred psychological functions are nothing but complexes that are, quote, actively intended by the individual and fostered by all the means in his power. The thing is, complexes were so crucial to the foundation of Jung's work that he originally called his school of thought complex psychology. So, what is a complex? According to Jung, complexes are subpersonalities within the psyche. Their basic features are that they can alter our emotional state, they can interfere with our conscious intentions, and they behave in persistent patterns. You can think of it like this. A complex has a particular shape to it, and once a complex is triggered, your experience begins to take on that shape. It's like a mold that's being applied to the cookie dough of your life. For people who like cookies, I thought that metaphor might be helpful. In everyday language, we might call a complex a sore spot. For example,
whatever you do, don't mention clown school to Jeffrey. He didn't get in, and it's been a sore spot ever since.
Now, if I have an inferiority complex, there's a good chance that this rejection from clown school will trigger that complex. And that one rejection is going to get fused with and confused with capital R rejection in my psyche. It's going to get colored by and shaded with parts of my past rejections. Old thought patterns are going to come up. Old emotions are going to come up. And being in that state is going to hijack my ego, and it's going to cause me to behave in compulsive ways. So I might tell myself consciously, it's okay. I can always apply to other clown schools. I'm going to get on that right now. But in reality, I just go into my bedroom and I end up sulking. True story? It's not a true story. Remember what I said before. Complexes have the power to actually alter your emotional state. They can shift your mood and shift your heart rate, your breathing. Jung actually discovered that different complexes have different physiological profiles. That's freaky, right? So where the preferred functions are an actively pursued one-sidedness, other complexes are typically experienced as disturbing, painful hijackings of the ego. Again, hence demon state. In my eyes, this all means that OPS is absolutely right to posit that savior functions and demon functions can be inferred/triangulated from state changes. The so-called cognitive functions are deeply somatic too. Instinct is another area where Jung's complex theory connects to the OPS model. Jung proposed that at the nucleus of every complex, there is an ancient instinctual mode of being. Let's say that a young man has a classic negative mother complex. Maybe his mother abandoned him at a young age, and so now he's on edge around every woman that he meets. Women around him pick up on his anxiety, their spidey senses tingle, and they decide, this is a guy that I need to avoid. And that only reinforces this complex pattern that he's trapped in. His fears of abandonment are reinforced. The complex itself is like a snowball accumulating new associations and new thoughts as it travels. Humans aren't blank slates. We come off the assembly line with all this neural circuitry that predisposes us to zero in on and then bond with a maternal figure. Within 24 hours of being born, babies can actually tell which voice among a set of voices belongs to its mother. And if something goes haywire with that process of maternal bonding, then it can haunt a person for life. And just as we are neurobiologically inclined towards acquiring mother complexes, so too do we have instinctual machinery for meeting the human needs used by the objective personality system. In other words, human beings come factory loaded with ancient hardware for handling things like status seeking, group cohesion, resource acquisition, harm avoidance. For me, that's why it's not even remotely outrageous to put forward the human needs of self, tribe, gathering, and organizing as the instinctive nuclei of the functions as complexes. Especially because it appears to me that those needs were already sitting right beneath the surface of the way that I was talking about the functions before I ever even knew what OPS was. I mean, the image of the lone TI truth seeker standing against the tribe is a classic at this point, a modern day classic. By the way, there's already a precedent for using the human needs in the context of Jung's ideas. James Hollis, who is the former executive director of the Jung Educational Center, uses the following framework of innate fears in his book, The Eden Project. We have the binary of nearness versus distance and change versus permanence. And in my opinion, those dichotomies map pretty cleanly onto the human needs. Focusing on self-significance and identity is an adaptation against the fear of being engulfed by the tribe. Tribe connection is an adaptation against the fear of distance, organizing to the fear of change, gathering to the fear of static permanence. As I said before, I think the objective personality system comes closest to honoring the core of Jung's ideas. And instead of saying that Dave and Shan are redefining the functions, I think it's way more accurate to say that they are refining the functions. And to unpack that fully, I think we need to talk a little bit about differentiation. Jung's approach to typology evolved a lot over the years, becoming increasingly differentiated with time. In other words, he came to realize that he was sometimes treating two distinct phenomena as if they were the same thing, and that realization necessitated introducing new concepts into his map of the psyche. For example, in some of his earliest musings about typology, Jung thought that thinking and introversion were exactly the same thing, and he thought that feeling and extroversion were the same thing. In my opinion, that was him projecting aspects of his own psyche into his understanding. It couldn't be helped. But as he got more experience as a clinician, as he met real human beings, he thought, hang on, this isn't quite sufficient. I see that there are people using their thinking in a more extroverted fashion and people using their feeling in a more introverted way. And so I personally interpret Dave and Shan's work as a welcome and much needed further differentiation of Jung's ideas. For Jung, introversion indicates the importance of the subject over the object, and extroversion indicates the opposite. As I see it, OPS takes the broad attitudes of introversion versus extroversion and carves each one into a rational and irrational component. We have self as subject versus tribe as object, and we have the known, the familiar as subject, and the unknown as the object. For me, that makes a lot of intuitive sense. Anyway, that was a lot, so here is the Spark Notes version of the video. Erik is right that there are gaps in the OPS theory. I'm trying to fill some of those in. Erik's characterization of the OPS functions as one-liners misses the mark. It does so by overlooking important contexts like state changes and the interlocking interdependence of the OPS parts. Additionally, Erik is wrong that OPS is redefining the Jungian functions. As I've argued, their definitions and their approach is closer to the spirit of Jung's ideas. In fact, OPS honors the core of Jung's ideas in a way that most other approaches to typology don't. For Jung, the psychological functions are complexes, and activated complexes can create physiological and emotional state changes. Therefore, psychological type can be inferred from state changes, which validates the savior versus demon notion in OPS. Additionally, all complexes are built around an archetypal instinctual core, and the four human needs make for strong candidates as the instinctive nuclei of the functions. Hence why it's best to think of OPS as refining as opposed to redefining the functions. All right, so some closing thoughts. Because the functions are complexes, they're going to have this snowball-like component to them where they're picking up a lifetime's worth of subjective associations. So your use of extroverted intuition is going to have a lot of idiosyncrasies compared to anyone else's. It's going to be colored with your autobiography, your culture, your family history, blah, blah, blah. And I suspect that this means that any elaborate attempt at defining the functions from the inside in the way that Erik seems to desire is doomed to failure. In my opinion, that's why most attempts at characterizing the functions
can be defined as hot air.
In one of his lectures, Jung says that he named the functions in the way that he did because they are parts of ordinary language. He even cautions against overcomplication, joking that, quote, "You should never ask a philosopher about thinking, because he is the only man who does not know what thinking is. Everybody else knows what thinking is." And so from that angle, maybe OPS's so-called simple definitions aren't so bad. Maybe they can give us grounding so that we don't build too many castles in the air. I think so anyway. Simple doesn't always mean simplistic, and I think that over the course of this video, I've demonstrated how the seemingly simple can be quite complex. Ding! Anyway, that's it for this episode of AutoAlchemy. Thanks for liking, commenting, and subscribing. Till next time.
Yeah.